My name is Patty Atkins, and I'd like to share my story of how I harmed a patient. It was 1987, and I was a 24-year-old, relatively new SICU nurse working the 3 to 11 shift. And my assignment that evening was to transfer the post-op day 3 heart surgery patient and admit the fresh post-op patient. And I had taken care of Vivian the day before, so I knew her and her husband, Joe, of 50 years. She was sitting up in the chair, almost ready for transfer. And my charge nurse, Ardith, was bringing the wheelchair in, and I told Joe that he could meet his wife out on 3 West in about 20 minutes. He leaned over and, with a smile, kissed her and said goodbye. What I realized later is that this would be their last kiss and final goodbye. There was just one more thing to do, and that was to discontinue the internal jugular IV. What I didn't know at the time was that patients needed to be flat when the central lines are discontinued. I took out the catheter, and Vivian arrested immediately. During the code, I told everyone what happened, and it wasn't until Carol, the clinical nurse specialist, said, "Do you mean you didn't lay her flat when you took out the central line? That can cause an air embolus." And I felt my heart pounding and my body just went numb as we locked eyes in that moment. And I was so scared that I caused this. And during the code, I remember asking the cardiologist running the code, "Do you think this was an air embolus? Do you think I caused this?" And he never looked me in the eye. I think that he felt bad for me. And he said, "No, I think this was probably a blood clot, that when she bore down, when you took out the catheter, came loose and she had a pulmonary embolus." And of course, we'll never know if it was an air embolus or if it was a blood clot that caused her death. But I knew that it was possible and even probable that I caused her death. A short while later, Joe came back in the room, and I was so stunned and speechless. I didn't know what to say, and so I just held his hand and told him I was sorry. Then I looked up and I saw charge nurse Ardith motioning to me that the fresh post-op heart patient was arriving. And so I squeezed Joe's hand one more time, and then I went into the next room and just went on with my shift. I think my reaction was largely based upon how other people reacted. And after that day, no one ever brought it up. No one ever asked me how I was doing. And so I just sort of built kind of an armor and tucked all those feelings away. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell any of my sisters, not even my mom. It was too painful. But how many times have I relived that event? Hundreds. Over and over and over. In hindsight, I wish my clinical nurse specialist would have checked in with me. I think it would have been helpful to process the feelings. I wish she would have partnered with me to say, you know, this was terrible, but let's turn it into something positive. Let's learn from this, and let's make sure this never happens to anyone ever again. There's the regret that I didn't turn it into something positive because it was so painful. There's shame for my lack of knowledge and my action that caused this, or probably caused it. And strangely, I felt guilt because I was so resilient. There were times I thought, what's wrong with you? This should bother you more. It wasn't until about 4 years ago, so that's 27 years later, that a friend of mine who is a therapist and has a very empathic presence was listening to my story, and he asked one question. He said, "How did it affect you emotionally?" And that's when the tears came for the first time. And I cried for Vivian, and I cried for Joe, and for their family. And I cried for that 24-year-old nurse, and all of the guilt and shame that I carried for all of those years. There's nothing that can ever erase the event. We can't undo what is done. Talking about it helps. Self-compassion helps. Turning it into something positive, the learning so that it doesn't happen to somebody else, now that I think will take me from being a survivor from this adverse event to thriving. And so I'm looking forward to being a resource to other people that this has happened to, because I think there's healing in sharing that and sharing my story and providing directly and indirectly, creating a safe culture so other people can feel comfortable sharing their stories. For every harm event, the suffering that patients and families go through saddens me. And in addition, I know with every event there are clinicians who are suffering. And my hope for the future is that we can create a culture of support in which we can offer each other empathy so that healing can take place.